guarantee was supposed to be an ordinary Tuesday morning. The supermarket was quiet. Just the hum of old fluorescent lights and the soft shuffle of tired feet. An elderly woman named Margaret waited in line, clutching a few groceries and an old photograph in her purse. Ahead of her, an old man trembled as he searched his pockets. His wallet was empty. The cashier's face turned impatient, but before anyone could speak, Margaret gently stepped forward and whispered, "It's okay. I'll cover it." The man lifted his head, and in that instant, time stopped. His cloudy eyes widened, his lips quivered, and he whispered something that made everyone freeze. "Margaret, after all these years?" The morning sunlight filtered softly through the blinds of a small, quiet house on Willow Street. The kettle hissed as Margaret poured herself a cup of tea, her hands trembling slightly, not from weakness, but from age. At 82, she had learned to live with silence. It had been her companion for decades, ever since the day her husband, Thomas, never came home from the war. On the mantelpiece, a single photograph remained framed in silver. A young woman in a nurse's uniform, standing beside a soldier with bright, proud eyes. She smiled faintly at the memory every morning before leaving for her errands. That photo was her ritual, her reminder that love, no matter how lost, still lingered in time. Her neighbors often saw her walking to the grocery store at the corner. She never used delivery services. She liked to walk, to see people, to feel alive. She carried a small purse with exact change, a habit Thomas had taught her when they were young newlyweds, struggling to make every cent count. That morning, Margaret dressed neatly as always, her cream cardigan buttoned, her grey hair pinned into a bun, and her cane tapping lightly against the pavement as she walked. She smiled at everyone she met, though few smiled back. People today were always in a rush, always looking at their phones, never at faces. As she entered the grocery store, the familiar bell chimed above the door. The scent of baked bread and coffee filled the air. Margaret moved slowly through the aisles, her shopping list folded neatly in her hand. "Milk, bread, tea and apples," she whispered softly to herself. It wasn't much, just enough for one person. But in her mind, she still shopped for two. Old habits die hard. Across the store, an old man stood by the canned goods section, his coat frayed and his hat tilted low. His name was George Thomason. Most people who saw him would think he was just another lonely pensioner, lost in the noise of a changing world. But inside, George carried a story that had never been told, a story buried beneath scars, amnesia, and decades of wandering. Years ago, during the war, George had been caught in an explosion that left him half-blind and without memory. He woke up in a field hospital under a different name, with no recollection of his past. For years, he believed he had no family, no home, until fragments of memory began to return. A woman's face, a smile, a name whispered through dreams. Margaret. For months, he had been searching, tracing names through old directories, calling churches, even visiting the town where his heart told him she might still be. And that morning, fate had led him here, to this small grocery store on Willow Street. Margaret reached for a loaf of bread when she noticed the old man ahead of her. He moved slowly, his hands shaking as he picked up a can and studied it for too long, as if the world had suddenly become unfamiliar. His clothes were clean but worn, and his expression carried a quiet sadness she recognized all too well. Her instinct, that gentle compassion that never left her, stirred. She thought of the days when she worked as a nurse during the war, helping soldiers just like him. Frightened, broken, lost. When she reached the counter, she saw him again. He was ahead of her in line, his basket filled with only a few basics. Bread, soup, a carton of milk. The cashier scanned each item quickly, then read out the total. "That'll be $17.45, sir." The old man reached into his coat, fumbling through his pockets, pulling out a few coins and an old wallet. His face fell. I'm sorry," he murmured.
I thought I had enough.
The people behind them shifted impatiently. One young man sighed loudly. Another woman muttered something under her breath. The cashier's voice turned colder.
Sir, if you don't have the full amount, I'll have to put these back. Margaret stepped forward without hesitation.
It's all right, she said softly, placing a few bills on the counter.
Please let him have them. The old man turned, startled.
His cloudy blue eyes locked onto hers. For a moment neither spoke. The world seemed to blur around them, the chatter, the noise, the impatience, all fading into silence. He whispered her name. Margaret? Her hand froze mid-air. What did you just say? Margaret.
His voice broke. It's me. It's Thomas. The cashier blinked, unsure if she had just witnessed a miracle or a misunderstanding. Margaret's heart pounded in her chest. That's impossible, she whispered.
My husband died in the war. But as she looked closer, beyond the wrinkles and the years, she saw him. The man she had loved, the man she had buried only in memory. The same curve of his smile, the same scar near his temple, now faded with age. Tears welled up in her eyes.
Thomas!
He nodded slowly, his hands trembling as he reached for hers.
I tried to find you. I didn't remember. Not for years.
But I never stopped feeling that something was missing. Someone. The grocery store had fallen silent. The cashier stared, frozen. The customers who had once been impatient now stood motionless, watching something sacred unfold before them. Two souls reunited after a lifetime apart. Margaret couldn't speak. The world around her faded to a dull hum. She felt dizzy, overwhelmed, yet alive in a way she hadn't been in decades. Thomas, she whispered again, her tears falling freely.
How are you alive?
They sat together later in the store's small cafe, 2 cups of tea between them. For the first time in 40 years, Margaret listened as Thomas, now George, told his story. He spoke of the explosion during the war, of waking in a hospital with no memory, no identity. He had been listed as missing in action. The military never found his records.
A local family had taken him in, giving him the name George Thomason. I started over, he said quietly, staring at the table.
But every night I dreamed of a woman with a soft voice.
I didn't know who she was, but she felt real.
Like I'd lost something I couldn't name. Margaret listened in disbelief, her mind spinning between grief and joy. All those years she had lived as a widow, wearing black, visiting his empty grave every anniversary, while he had been alive, lost somewhere in the world. You tried to find me?
She asked, her voice trembling. I did, he said.
Once I remembered your name, I searched every record I could. I came here because this was the address I found under Margaret Hayes. I didn't know if it was you, she smiled faintly. It was me all along. As the hours passed, the 2 elderly souls sat together like young lovers rediscovering time. Every story he told awakened a forgotten memory. She remembered the picnic near the lake where he first confessed his love, the letter he wrote before leaving for the war, the promise he made to return, and now, after all these years, he had kept that promise, even if fate had taken the long way around. Margaret looked out the cafe window, watching people rush past, unaware of the miracle taking place inside. She turned back to Thomas and said softly, I thought I had lost you forever. But maybe God had other plans, he smiled, his eyes glistening. Maybe he did.
Maybe he knew we still had one last cup of tea left together. They laughed quietly, the sound soft and pure, like the first note of a forgotten song. That evening, Margaret invited him to her home.
She wanted him to see the life she had built, the house they had dreamed of owning when they were young and poor. As they walked, their hands brushed, and she felt a strange comfort, as if no time had passed at all. Inside, the house smelled of old books and lavender. The walls were lined with photographs, her wedding, her nursing years, her late parents. Thomas stopped in front of one photo, the one of them together in uniform. He reached out and touched the frame. "You kept it," he said softly. "Every day," she replied.
I couldn't let go. He turned to her, his voice trembling.
"Margaret,
I'm so sorry.
for the years I lost, for the pain I caused you without knowing." She smiled gently and shook her head. "Don't be sorry.
You came back."
That's all that matters." As night fell, they sat in her living room by the fireplace. Margaret poured tea while Thomas told her about his life, how he had worked as a carpenter, lived in small towns, never married again because deep down he felt that his heart still belonged to someone he couldn't remember. "I used to sit by the window every night," he said. "I'd look at the stars and ask myself, is someone looking at the same sky thinking of me?"
Now I know.
"You were." Tears filled her eyes again, but this time they were tears of peace, not sorrow. She took his hand and whispered,
I never stopped waiting. The clock struck 9.
and for the first time in decades, the old house felt alive again. 2 cups sat half empty on the table, steam curling into the warm air. Outside, rain began to fall softly, tapping against the windows. The world seemed to fade away, leaving only them. 2 old souls reunited by chance, or perhaps by fate. As Thomas looked around,
He noticed something on the shelf, an unopened letter, yellowed with age. What's that?
he asked. Margaret smiled faintly. "It's your last letter. It was returned to me. Sender unknown. I never opened it."
I couldn't bear to. He reached for it with trembling hands.
"May I?" She nodded. He carefully tore it open.
Inside was a note written decades ago in faded ink. My dearest Margaret, if I don't make it back, know that I loved you every day of my life.
"But if fate allows, I'll find my way home to you, even if I have to wander the earth to do it. Yours forever, Thomas." When he finished reading, the silence between them was filled with tears, not of sadness, but of completion. Margaret whispered, "You kept your word." He smiled softly. "I told you, I always would." That night, as he prepared to leave, Margaret stopped him at the door. "Thomas, you don't have to go," she said quietly. "There's a spare room here, if you'd like to stay a while." He hesitated, emotion flooding his face. "Are you sure?" She smiled warmly.
After 40 years, I think it's time we had breakfast together again. He chuckled through tears. I'd like that very much. And as he stepped inside, the wind outside seemed to calm.
The house that had once echoed with silence now held the sound of footsteps, familiar ones, returning home at last. The next morning, the golden rays of dawn spilled gently through the curtains of Margaret's cosy kitchen. The smell of fresh coffee drifted through the air, a scent she hadn't prepared for anyone else in over 4 decades. Thomas sat quietly at the table, staring at the familiar surroundings as if he'd stepped back into a world he once dreamed of. The ticking of the old wall clock echoed softly between them. It was the same clock they had bought together the week after their wedding, still working, still keeping time, as though waiting for this moment. Margaret placed a small plate of buttered toast in front of him.
You still take 2 sugars, right?
She asked with a warm smile. Thomas chuckled. "You remembered." "I never forget small things," she replied, taking her seat across from him. For a long moment, they simply sat there. No need for words, only the comfort of shared silence. Outside, the world continued as usual, but inside that little kitchen, time had slowed to a tender pause. As the day went on, word of their reunion spread through the neighborhood. Mrs. Henderson, the chatty woman from across the street,
Nearly dropped her mail when she saw Thomas stepping out of Margaret's house. Margaret Hayes!
she exclaimed, rushing over.
You'll never believe this. I saw you walking with a man this morning. Is it true? Is that your husband?
"The one everyone thought had passed?" Margaret smiled shyly. "Yes, it's true. He came back." Mrs. Henderson's eyes widened with delight.
Oh, heavens. This is like something out of a movie.
Wait till I tell the ladies at church. Margaret laughed softly.
Please don't make a fuss. We're still adjusting, but it was too late.
By afternoon, the entire street buzzed with whispers. The miracle reunion, the war widow whose husband had returned after 40 years. Some doubted the story. Others called it divine intervention. For Margaret, it didn't matter. She didn't need anyone else to believe it. She only needed to feel it. That evening, Thomas and Margaret sat on the porch, wrapped in a shared blanket as the sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and rose. "It feels strange," he said quietly, "being back."
Everything's the same, yet different, Margaret nodded. I felt the same when you left.
The house stayed still, but I didn't recognize my own life anymore. He turned to her, eyes glistening with regret.
You should have moved on.
"You deserved happiness. I tried," she admitted, her voice soft but steady. "But every time someone new came into my life, I couldn't do it. You are the love of my life, Thomas." He reached for her hand and held it gently, the way he used to. "And you were mine, even when I didn't remember your name." They sat there until the stars appeared, letting the quiet night fill the spaces that years had taken from them. Days turned into weeks, and Thomas began to settle into Margaret's home. He helped her with groceries, repaired broken shelves, even tended to the small garden she had almost given up on. For the first time in years, laughter echoed through the walls again. Yet beneath the joy, there was something unspoken, a shadow of uncertainty. One morning, while Thomas was pruning roses, a man in a dark coat appeared at the gate. He introduced himself as Mr. Callahan, a representative from the Veterans Records Department. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, "we received your inquiry about your husband's disappearance years ago. I understand he's recently been found." Margaret looked at Thomas, puzzled. "Yes." "He's right here," Mr. Callahan nodded politely, then opened a folder.
That's remarkable.
"But there's something we need to verify." He showed them a document, an old military report. According to this, Private Thomas Hayes was declared deceased in 1951. However, a soldier matching his description was treated in a field hospital under the name George Thomason. "We've been trying to reconcile those records for decades." Thomas frowned. "That's me. I was told my name was George Thomason. They said I didn't have any identification." Mr. Callahan sighed. "That explains a lot. You were listed as missing in action because no one could confirm your survival."
But, he hesitated, there's one complication.
"During your recovery, someone filed documents using your assumed name. You received veteran benefits under George Thomason for nearly 20 years. Margaret's expression tensed. "What does that mean?" "It means," Mr. Callahan said carefully, "legally, your husband might still be considered deceased. We'll need to reopen the file, confirm his identity, and possibly reverse those records." Margaret looked at Thomas with concern. "Will that affect him?"
Not badly, Callahan assured.
"It's mostly paperwork, but it may take time, and it might bring some attention." After the man left, Margaret turned to Thomas. "Do you think this could cause trouble?" Thomas shook his head. "I don't care about papers or records."
I only care that I found you again, she smiled softly.
"Then that's all that matters." But as days passed, the past began to seep back into their quiet lives. Old memories returned in fragments, some sweet, others haunting. Thomas began having dreams again, flashes of the explosion, the screaming soldiers, the hospital bed where he woke up with no name. Sometimes he'd wake in the middle of the night, calling out names Margaret didn't recognize. One night, she found him sitting by the window, trembling. "It's okay," she whispered, wrapping a shawl around him. "You're safe now." He looked at her, eyes filled with guilt.
I keep remembering things.
"But some of them don't make sense."
I remember a woman's voice, not yours.
"Someone who helped me when I was lost." Margaret felt her chest tighten. "Do you think you might have known her?"
I don't know, he said honestly.
"All I know is, when I close my eyes, I see two lives. one that ended in war and another that began without memory. And now both have collided. She nodded slowly, her voice gentle. Then maybe this is our chance to make sense of it all, together. The next day they visited the old military archives. Dusty files, faded photos, and forgotten names surrounded them. After hours of searching, Thomas found a black and white photo that stopped his heart. A picture of himself, sitting beside a nurse at a field hospital. "That's her," he whispered. Margaret leaned in.
Who? The woman I remembered.
She was one of the nurses who helped me recover. Her name's written here, Evelyn Parker. Margaret felt a pang of emotion, part jealousy, part compassion. She took his hand. "She must have cared for you when I couldn't, I think."
She saved you. Thomas nodded. She did.
"But she's gone now. I found her obituary last year."
Maybe she's the reason I'm still here.
To finish what life left undone, Margaret smiled through tears. "And maybe she led you back to me." Over the following weeks, their bond grew stronger. They spent their evenings revisiting old memories, photographs, letters, and songs from their youth. Thomas began writing again, filling notebooks with his thoughts, trying to piece together the missing years. One evening, Margaret found him sketching something, the small grocery store where they had met again. "You're drawing?" she asked, surprised. He smiled. "I used to sketch you while you read by the window." "You never noticed," she laughed. "I did. I just pretended not to." They shared a moment of pure laughter, the kind that erases decades of pain in seconds. But just as life began to feel whole again, a letter arrived from the Veterans Department. It stated that Thomas's case would be reopened publicly and the local press might contact them to confirm his identity. Margaret read it carefully, her hands trembling. "They're going to make this a story, Thomas. They'll ask questions, dig into our past."
Are you ready for that?
He placed his hand over hers. "If it helps others who are lost like me, then yes. But if it hurts you, I'll walk away from it all." She shook her head firmly.
No, you've been lost long enough.
"It's time the world knows you found your way home." That night, they sat under the stars again, the same stars that had once separated them, now shining down on their reunion. Margaret whispered, "Do you ever think about what life would have been if you never went to war?" Thomas looked up at the sky. "Every day. But then I realized maybe everything had to happen exactly as it did, so I could find you again now, when we both needed it most." She leaned her head on his shoulder, eyes closed, heart at peace. And for the first time in 40 years, Margaret Hayes fell asleep, not as a widow but as a wife, with her husband beside her, the ticking clock echoing softly in the background, keeping time for them once more. At first, Margaret thought it would pass quietly, a heartwarming story that might inspire a few smiles before being forgotten. But within days it spread everywhere. Reporters showed up outside her house, cameras flashing, questions flying. How did it feel seeing him again after so long? Do you believe this was divine intervention? What message do you have for people who've lost loved ones? Margaret smiled politely, answering what she could, protecting what was sacred. But Thomas, once a man of calm and quiet dignity, struggled with the sudden attention. He wasn't used to microphones, cameras, or strangers treating his pain like entertainment. "I don't want to be a story," he whispered one evening, pacing the living room. "I just wanted to be her husband again." Margaret placed her hand gently on his arm.
I know, love.
"They'll lose interest soon. We just have to be patient." But patience wasn't enough. A week later, a new headline appeared, one that changed everything. War survivor lived under false identity. Government to investigate benefit fraud. The article claimed that Thomas, under the name George Thomason, had received payments he wasn't entitled to. They made it sound intentional, cruel even, as if he had tricked the government instead of simply surviving with a broken mind. Reporters no longer came with smiles. They came with microphones like weapons, demanding answers. "Mr. Hayes, did you knowingly accept those benefits?" Is it true you hid your real identity for financial gain? Thomas froze in every interview. He couldn't remember half of what they asked. His mind, already fragile from age and trauma, began to blur again. I didn't know, he said quietly one night, his voice cracking.
I didn't even know who I was.
And now they're calling me a liar. Margaret wrapped her arms around him. You did nothing wrong. You survived, Wantes. That's all that matters. But deep down, she knew this storm wasn't over. The government began to review his case officially. Letters arrived daily, notices, requests for documentation, even threats to recover the benefits he'd received. Margaret tried to manage it all, but it was overwhelming. One afternoon, while sorting through papers, she found something strange. An old envelope with Thomas's name written in faded ink. Dated 1952, inside was a letter addressed to the military, explaining that the soldier named Thomas Hayes had been found alive but was suffering from severe memory loss.
It was signed Evelyn Parker. Margaret froze.
Evelyn, the nurse who had cared for him. She read the letter again and again. Evelyn had tried to contact the authorities, but the report was lost in the chaos of post-war bureaucracy. She even wrote, he believes his name is George. I pray someone finds his family. He deserves to go home. Tears filled Margaret's eyes. Evelyn had tried to do the right thing. She had tried to bring him home decades ago. That evening, she showed the letter to Thomas. His hands trembled as he read it. She remembered me, he whispered. All this time she tried to help. Margaret smiled softly.
And she did.
Her letter may be the proof that clears your name. The next day, Margaret brought the letter to the veteran's office. The clerk, a young man named Daniel, looked surprised as he read it. This changes everything, he said. It proves you weren't pretending. You were injured, lost your memory, and the system failed you. You might even be eligible for back pay and recognition. Margaret didn't care about money. She only wanted peace for Thomas.
Please, she said.
He's been through enough, Daniel nodded kindly. We'll take care of it.
And Mrs. Hayes.
This letter is a treasure. You may have just restored his honor. But even as the legal troubles began to resolve, the emotional scars deepened. Thomas had started spending long hours alone in the garden, staring into space. Sometimes he'd speak softly to himself, as if trying to stitch memories together. I keep remembering faces, he said one evening.
Soldiers, doctors, her, Evelyn?
Margaret asked gently. He nodded. She used to sit by my bed and read to me. I think she was lonely too. Margaret felt a small sting in her heart, but she didn't let it show.
She must have been kind.
You were lucky she found you? I was luckier that you waited, he said, his eyes glistening. All those years I didn't even know what I was missing. But somehow my heart still waited for you. Margaret smiled through tears. Maybe that's what real love is, the kind that waits even when the mind forgets. Weeks later, the town held a small ceremony in their honor. The mayor presented Thomas with a medal, officially reinstating his name and recognizing him as a war survivor. People clapped and cried as the old couple stood hand in hand under the warm afternoon sun. It should have been their happiest moment. But as Thomas accepted the medal, his hand began to tremble. The flashes from the photographer's cameras mimicked explosions in his mind. In an instant, the applause faded, replaced by the deafening sound of war. He gasped, staggering backward.
No, get down. They're coming.
The crowd fell silent as Margaret rushed to his side.
Thomas, it's okay, it's over.
But he didn't hear her. He was trapped in his memories, shouting orders, ducking for cover. It took minutes for him to calm down, trembling in her arms, tears streaking his face. When he finally came back to the present, he whispered, I'm sorry.
I thought I was stronger than this. Margaret held him close.
You survived the war once, Thomas. You'll survive it again, this time with me beside you. After that day, the crowds disappeared. The media lost interest. Life returned to its quiet rhythm. Except now, Margaret noticed something different in Thomas. He had grown quieter, more distant. Sometimes he'd forget where he was. Other times he'd call her Evelyn by mistake. Each time her heart cracked a little more, but she hid it behind a brave smile. One evening she sat beside him on the porch, holding his hand. "You're slipping away again, aren't you?" He looked at her with tired eyes. "I don't want to, but my mind,
It's like a fog.
some days I wake up and I don't know which life I'm in." She nodded, tears falling silently. "Then I'll remind you. Every day I'll tell you who you are and who I am until the fog clears." He smiled weakly. "Promise." "I promise." In the weeks that followed, Margaret kept that promise. Each morning she'd pour 2 cups of tea, sit across from him and tell him their story. How they met.
How they fell in love, how she paid for his groceries, the day fate brought him home, and each time
He'd listen as if hearing it for the first time. Sometimes he'd cry, sometimes he'd laugh. But always he'd hold her hand tightly at the end and whisper, "I remember now." Those words became her light. Proof that love could outshine even the darkest memory. One rainy afternoon, Margaret found him asleep in the armchair, a sketchbook open on his lap. Inside was a drawing of her, young and smiling, standing in front of the grocery store. At the bottom, he had written in shaky handwriting, "The day I found home again." She pressed the page to her chest and wept softly. Later, when he woke, she whispered, "You know, you never really left me, not even when the world thought you were gone." He smiled faintly.
"And you never stopped waiting," she nodded.
"Because love doesn't die in war. It just waits for peace." That evening, as thunder rolled across the sky, Thomas turned to her and said quietly, "If I forget again tomorrow, don't be sad. Just tell me the story one more time. Tell me about the woman who paid for a stranger's groceries and found her husband instead." Margaret took his hand, her voice trembling but steady. "I'll tell it every day, if I have to, until the very end." And as the rain fell outside, the two sat together, 2 old souls who had crossed time, memory, and loss, holding on to the one thing that never faded. Love that remembered. Even when the mind forgot, the days grew shorter. Autumn painted the town in gold and rust, but inside the Hayes home, time moved differently. Slower, quieter, heavier. Thomas's memory began slipping more often. At first, it was small, forgetting what day it was, calling the cat by the wrong name. But then he forgot the route to the kitchen, the reason for the ringing phone, and finally, sometimes, even who she was. One morning, Margaret found him sitting by the window, staring into the mist, his breakfast untouched.
"Thomas?"
She said softly, placing a hand on his shoulder. He turned to her, polite, cautious, as if she were a stranger.
"I'm sorry, Mum," he said gently.
"Have we met?" The words cut through her like ice. She swallowed hard, forcing a trembling smile.
"Yes, my love."
"I'm Margaret, your wife." He frowned, searching her face, confusion clouding his eyes. Then he whispered, "I had a wife, but she died."
Years ago, Margaret's breath caught.
For a moment she couldn't speak. Then, through tears, she said softly, "No, Thomas.
"I'm right here."
You came home to me." But he only looked away, his gaze lost in the fog outside. That evening, she sat alone at the kitchen table, her tea gone cold. The house felt bigger somehow, emptier. She'd thought finding him again was the miracle, but now she realized keeping him was the harder one. The next day, she brought out their old photo albums. She turned the pages with him, reminding him of the life they shared, their wedding day, the little house they built, the garden he planted. "See this?" she said, pointing at a black and white photo of them at a picnic. You said my pie was so bad, even the birds refused it. He chuckled faintly, though his eyes still seemed uncertain.
I did say that?
She smiled. You did, and I didn't bake for a week. Something flickered in his expression. Recognition. Faint, but real.
You were so mad at me. I was, she whispered.
But I never stopped loving you. For a moment, his hand tightened around hers. Then he looked at her again and said, You have kind eyes. You remind me of someone. Her heart broke silently, but she only nodded. I remind you of home, Thomas. That's all that matters. As days passed, his condition worsened. Some mornings he'd wander outside barefoot, convinced he needed to report for duty. Other times he'd call her Evelyn, thinking she was the nurse who once cared for him. Margaret learned not to correct him harshly. She'd simply guide him back, her voice calm and warm.
Come on, love, she'd whisper. It's time to rest.
The war's over, and each time he'd look at her with childlike confusion and say, Is it? Did we win? Yes, she'd answer softly. We won. You came home. One night she woke to the sound of footsteps. Thomas was standing by the front door, fully dressed, holding an old duffel bag. Where are you going? She asked, heart pounding. He turned slowly. They need me back at the camp. The men are waiting. Margaret stepped closer, trembling. Thomas, the war ended 40 years ago. You're safe.
You're home. But he shook his head, panic setting in. No, if I don't go, they'll think I deserted.
She reached for him, tears streaming. You didn't desert anyone. You've done enough.
Please, stay with me. For a long moment he stood frozen, torn between past and present.
Then his eyes softened. Margaret?
Yes, she whispered. It's me. He dropped the bag, collapsing into her arms.
I keep losing the war in my head, he murmured. She held him tightly, whispering into his ear. Then I'll keep reminding you that you already won. Weeks later, the doctor confirmed what she already knew. Thomas was entering the final stages of dementia. There would be more confusion, more memory loss, and eventually, silence. Margaret listened quietly, her hands clasped in her lap. Will he still know me? She asked in a small voice. The doctor hesitated. Some days he might.
Others, maybe not.
But people like him. They remember feelings. Even when faces fade, love doesn't. She nodded, holding on to that thought like a prayer. Winter arrived early that year. The first snow dusted the town in white, and the world seemed to slow down, as if holding its breath. Margaret decorated the small tree in their living room, humming softly. Thomas sat nearby, watching her with a vacant but peaceful expression. Pretty lights, he said. Reminds me of Christmas with... He trailed off, frowning, trying to reach for the memory. With me, she finished gently. Every year, you'd burn the cookies and we'd end up ordering pie instead. He chuckled, though unsure why. Sounds like something I'd do. It was, she smiled. She handed him an ornament, a small heart-shaped one, engraved with their names. Thomas and Margaret, 1951. He turned it over slowly, his thumb tracing the letters.
That's us?
She nodded. He smiled faintly. We must have loved each other very much. Tears welled in her eyes. We still do. That night, as the snow fell softly outside, she sat beside his bed, reading aloud the story of their life. The grocery line, the reunion, the miracle. His eyes fluttered as he listened, his breathing slow and steady. When she finished, she whispered, Do you remember now, my love? There was a long silence. Then, in a voice fragile as glass, he whispered, Yes. I remember the way you looked at me that day.
Like you saw me before I even knew who I was. Her tears fell freely now.
You were always my Thomas, he smiled faintly. And you were always my miracle. The next morning, she woke to find the sun filtering through the curtains, and the room too quiet. Thomas lay peacefully, his hand still in hers, his face serene. For a moment she thought he was asleep, But then she noticed the stillness of his chest, the calm finality of his expression. She didn't cry at first. She just sat there, holding his hand, whispering through the silence. "You found your way home, my love. You're free now." After a while, she kissed his forehead and whispered, "Rest easy, soldier. The war's over for good." A week later, the town gathered again, and this time, not for a reunion, but for a farewell. Margaret stood at the small church podium, her black dress trembling in the winter wind. She spoke softly, but her words carried through the room like music. Thomas spent half his life lost, not in distance, but in memory. But love found him, and love brought him home. He didn't remember every moment, but he remembered how it felt to be loved. And that was enough. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. When the service ended, she placed the heart-shaped ornament on his casket, their names gleaming in the light. Then, with a trembling smile, she whispered, "Until we meet again at the grocery line, my love." Later, alone at home, she sat by the window where he used to watch the street. The first snow of the new year began to fall, soft and endless. She closed her eyes, and for a fleeting moment, she could almost hear his voice. Warm, familiar.
"I found you again, Maggie," she smiled through her tears.
"And I'll keep finding you." Every time it snows, outside the street lamp flickered, casting a golden glow over the snow-covered road. The same road where, months ago, a tired old man had stood in line, and a widow had reached out her hand, and, somewhere between memory and eternity, love began again. For a moment his hand tightened around hers. Then he looked at her again and said, "You have kind eyes. You remind me of someone." Her heart broke silently, but she only nodded. "I remind you of home, Thomas. That's all that matters." As days passed, his condition worsened. Some mornings he'd wander outside barefoot, convinced he needed to report for duty. Other times he'd call her Evelyn, thinking she was the nurse who once cared for him. Margaret learned not to correct him harshly. She'd simply guide him back, her voice calm and warm.
"Come on, love," she'd whisper. "It's time to rest."
The war's over, and each time he'd look at her with childlike confusion and say, "Is it? Did we win?" "Yes," she'd answer softly. "We won. You came home." One night she woke to the sound of footsteps. Thomas was standing by the front door, fully dressed, holding an old duffel bag. "Where are you going?" she asked, heart pounding. He turned slowly. "They need me back at the camp." "The men are waiting." Margaret stepped closer, trembling. "Thomas, the war ended 40 years ago. You're safe."
"You're home." But he shook his head, panic setting in. No, if I don't go, they'll think I deserted."
She reached for him, tears streaming. "You didn't desert anyone. You've done enough."
"Please, stay with me." For a long moment he stood frozen, torn between past and present.
Then his eyes softened. "Margaret?"
"Yes," she whispered. "It's me." He dropped the bag, collapsing into her arms.
"I keep losing the war in my head," he murmured. She held him tightly, whispering into his ear, "Then I'll keep reminding you that you already won." Weeks later, the doctor confirmed what she already knew. Thomas was entering the final stages of dementia. There would be more confusion, more memory loss, and eventually, silence. Margaret listened quietly, her hands clasped in her lap. "Will he still know me?" she asked in a small voice. The doctor hesitated. "Some days he might.
Others, maybe not."
But people like him, they remember feelings. Even when faces fade, love doesn't." She nodded, holding on to that thought like a prayer. Winter arrived early that year. The first snow dusted the town in white, and the world seemed to slow down, as if holding its breath. Margaret decorated the small tree in their living room, humming softly. Thomas sat nearby, watching her with a vacant but peaceful expression. "Pretty lights," he said. "Reminds me of Christmas with..." He trailed off, frowning, trying to reach for the memory. "With me," she finished gently. "Every year. You'd burn the cookies, and we'd end up ordering pie instead. He chuckled, though unsure why. Sounds like something I'd do. It was, she smiled. She handed him an ornament, a small heart-shaped one, engraved with their names. Thomas and Margaret, 1951. He turned it over slowly, his thumb tracing the letters.
That's us?
She nodded. He smiled faintly. We must have loved each other very much. Tears welled in her eyes. We still do. That night, as the snow fell softly outside, she sat beside his bed, reading aloud the story of their life. The grocery line, the reunion, the miracle. His eyes fluttered as he listened, his breathing slow and steady. When she finished, she whispered, "Do you remember now, my love?" There was a long silence. Then, in a voice fragile as glass, he whispered, "Yes. I remember the way you looked at me that day."
Like you saw me before I even knew who I was. Her tears fell freely now.
You were always my Thomas, he smiled faintly. And you were always my miracle. The next morning, she woke to find the sun filtering through the curtains, and the room too quiet. Thomas lay peacefully, his hand still in hers, his face serene. For a moment she thought he was asleep, but then she noticed the stillness of his chest, the calm finality of his expression. She didn't cry at first. She just sat there, holding his hand, whispering through the silence. You found your way home, my love. You're free now. After a while, she kissed his forehead and whispered, Rest easy, soldier. The war's over for good. A week later, the town gathered again, and this time, not for a reunion, but for a farewell. Margaret stood at the small church podium, her black dress trembling in the winter wind. She spoke softly, but her words carried through the room like music. Thomas spent half his life lost, not in distance, but in memory. But love found him, and love brought him home. He didn't remember every moment, but he remembered how it felt to be loved.
And that was enough. There wasn't a dry eye in the room.
Winter turned to spring. The snow melted from the sidewalks and flowers began to bloom outside the Hayes house. But inside, the air still carried traces of him. The scent of old cologne, the sound of a chair creaking, the faint echo of his laughter in the hallway. Margaret had kept his things just as he left them. His hat still hung by the door, his books rested beside the armchair, and his photo sat on the nightstand where she kissed it each morning before she prayed. It was strange how a house could hold memories like dust. Quiet, invisible, but always there. Most days she found herself visiting the local grocery store, the same one where everything had started. The cashiers smiled softly whenever she came. Everyone knew her now. The old lady who once paid for an old man's groceries and changed 2 lives forever. But for Margaret, that store had become something sacred, not a place of shopping, but of miracles. One day, as she waited in line again, she noticed a young mother struggling at the counter. Her toddler cried as the cashier scanned items one by one. When the total flashed on the screen, the young woman's face paled. "I'm sorry," she whispered, fumbling with her purse. "Can you take out the milk?" Margaret's heart ached. Without hesitation, she stepped forward and said gently, "Leave it in."
I'll cover it. The young woman turned, eyes wide with disbelief. "Oh, ma'am, I can't let you—" "You can," Margaret interrupted softly, with a smile that had known both joy and grief. "Someone once did the same for me." Tears welled in the young woman's eyes. "Thank you."
"Thank you so much." Margaret only nodded, whispering to herself as she watched the child's face light up. Keep the miracle going. That small act of kindness didn't go unnoticed. A man in line behind them recorded the moment quietly on his phone. Later, he posted it online with the caption, "An elderly woman pays for a struggling mother's groceries, says, 'Someone once did the same for me.' We need more souls like hers." The video spread faster than anyone expected. Within a week, it had millions of views. People from around the world commented, sharing their own stories of kindness, loss, and love rediscovered. Margaret had no idea she'd become a symbol. She didn't even know what going viral meant. But every day after that, strangers began to visit her house, some bringing flowers, some just wanting to say thank you, and others leaving letters at her door. One of those letters came from a man who wrote, "My father had dementia. Watching your story reminded me to love him more patiently. Thank you for teaching me that memory may fade, but love doesn't." Margaret sat by the window, tears glistening as she read each letter aloud, as if sharing them with Thomas, who she believed still listened from somewhere beyond. Months passed. The town held a small ceremony at the local park, dedicating a bench in honor of Thomas and Margaret Hayes, proof that love always finds its way home. The mayor himself gave a short speech. In a world that often forgets kindness, Margaret reminded us that one gentle act can echo across generations.
Love found its way through war, time, and memory, and it began with a single act of compassion at a grocery store. As the crowd applauded, Margaret placed her hand over the engraved plaque.
The metal was cool beneath her fingertips, but it felt alive with meaning. She smiled faintly and whispered, "You'd hate all this attention, Thomas." The wind blew gently, carrying with it the scent of lilacs, his favorite. That evening, she returned home and sat by the same window where they'd shared so many quiet moments. The sunset spilled gold over the horizon, and in the fading light she took out a small box she'd kept hidden in the drawer. Inside was the old grocery receipt, the one from the day they met again. The ink had faded, but she could still make out the numbers, the date, and the tiny signature at the bottom. She held it close to her chest, whispering, "This little piece of paper started everything." Then she smiled softly, "And ended nothing." As years went by, Margaret grew frailer, her steps slower, but her spirit remained as luminous as ever. She continued her small acts of kindness, paying for groceries, donating to the local church, leaving flowers on strangers' graves. People began calling her the grocery angel. Whenever someone tried to thank her, she'd only smile and say, "Don't thank me, just pass it on." One quiet morning, the town awoke to news that broke their hearts. Margaret Hayes had passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 92. On her nightstand lay three things: the photograph of her and Thomas on their wedding day, the heart-shaped ornament with their names, and the faded grocery receipt. Folded neatly beneath her hand, beside it was a note written in her delicate handwriting. "Don't cry for me. I've gone shopping with Thomas again." At her funeral, hundreds gathered, families, children, strangers, even the young mother she once helped. Everyone had a story about how Margaret's kindness had touched their lives. The same cashier who once witnessed that first act of generosity stood at the podium, tears rolling down her cheeks. "She taught me that miracles don't always happen in churches or hospitals," she said. "Sometimes they happen between aisles 4 and 5, when one heart recognizes another." The crowd smiled through their tears. As the casket was lowered beside Thomas's, a soft rain began to fall, gentle, cleansing, like the sky itself was blessing their reunion. That night, as the rain turned to mist, a faint glow appeared over the town. Some said it was the moon breaking through the clouds. Others swore it was something else, two soft lights, side by side, drifting through the night like the spirits of two souls finally at peace. And somewhere, in the quiet corners of heaven, Thomas and Margaret walked hand in hand once more through endless aisles of light, laughter echoing softly. "You found me again," she said.
"Always," he whispered.
"Even when I forget, my heart remembers." Epilogue. Years later. 10 years after Margaret's passing, the grocery store still stood. Renovated, modern, brighter than before. Near the entrance, a plaque hung proudly. The Grocery Miracle, in memory of Thomas and Margaret Hayes.
A simple act of kindness can last longer than a
Lifetime. Beneath it sat a small donation box, labelled Pay It Forward Fund. Every dollar collected went toward helping families in need of groceries. The young mother from years ago, now older with a teenage son, managed the store. Every December, she organized the Hayes Day, a community event where strangers helped pay for each other's groceries, keeping the legacy alive. And every time someone asked her why she did it, she'd smile and say, because one day,
an old lady paid for mine. And in that moment, I saw what love looks like. The camera pans out, the grocery store glowing under the warm afternoon light.
people laughing, helping one another, children holding flowers, and as the music swells softly, a familiar voice narrates one last line. Margaret's voice, gentle and eternal. Sometimes love doesn't come with grand gestures or perfect timing. Sometimes it just stands quietly in a grocery line and decides to pay. The days after Samuel's passing felt quieter than ever. Margaret moved through her home like a ghost, every creak of the floorboard echoing memories of him. His laughter, his stories, his gentle way of saying her name. The chair where he once sat now stood empty, yet somehow it still held his presence. She kept the old photograph he'd cherished beside her bed, the one of her younger self that he never realized was her. Sometimes she would sit there for hours, tracing the edges of the faded picture, whispering words she never got to say aloud. I found you, Sam. Even when the world forgot I didn't. The days turned to weeks, and the ache in her heart softened into something quieter, something almost peaceful. Margaret began volunteering at the local store where they'd met. It was her way of staying close to that one miraculous moment that brought them together again. She'd help customers pack their bags, smile at strangers, and pay for someone's groceries now and then. Just as she had that day, one afternoon, a young man came through her line, nervous, fumbling with his coins, clearly embarrassed. The cashier gave him a sympathetic look, but before he could speak, Margaret gently placed her hand on the counter and said softly, "It's all right, sweetheart.
I'll cover it." The young man looked up, eyes wide, surprised and grateful.
You sure, Mom?" She smiled, her wrinkled face glowing with the kind of warmth that only comes from a lifetime of love and loss. Kindness has a way of coming back, she said. As he left, she felt a strange calm wash over her, the same kind she used to feel sitting beside Samuel. She turned toward the window, where the sunlight spilled golden through the glass, and for a fleeting second, she thought she saw him standing outside, that familiar silhouette, smiling softly, his hand lifted in goodbye. Margaret blinked, and he was gone. But she didn't feel alone, not anymore. That night, she sat by her window, a cup of tea warming her palms. The city lights shimmered in the distance, and she whispered into the quiet, Thank you for finding me again, Sam. A soft wind moved through the curtains, brushing her cheek like a gentle kiss. She smiled, tears glistening, but her heart finally at peace. The camera would slowly pull back, showing her small, cozy home illuminated by the warm glow of a lamp, her silhouette framed against the window, and as the music swells, a soft voice would echo her final words. Love doesn't end when time does.
It just finds a new way to stay.